The December wind howled through the streets of Ouray, Colorado, as Eleanor Daniels pressed her gloved hands against the frosted window of the town hall, watching the golden light spill out onto the snow-covered ground below. She could hear the fiddle music from where she stood in the upstairs room, the lively notes of Christmas carols mixing with laughter and the shuffling of dancing feet. And she wondered why she had even bothered to come. 3 months had passed since her father's death in a mining accident up in the San Juan Mountains, and the grief still sat heavy in her chest like a stone. Her mother had insisted she attend the Christmas dance, saying it would do her good to be around people instead of hiding away in their small cabin on the edge of town. But now that Eleanor was here, she felt more alone than ever. She smoothed down the front of her dark green dress, one of only 2 nice dresses she owned, and made her way down the narrow staircase to the main hall. The room was packed with townspeople, ranchers from the surrounding valleys, miners fresh from their claims, and families dressed in their Sunday best. Paper snowflakes hung from the rafters, and someone had brought in pine boughs that filled the air with their sharp, clean scent. The band consisted of old Mr. Patterson on fiddle, his son on guitar, and young Timothy Wells on harmonica, and they were playing with such enthusiasm that Eleanor could not help but feel a small spark of warmth despite her sadness. She found a chair along the wall, as far from the dancing as she could manage while still being in the room, and sat down carefully. The other young women her age were clustered together near the refreshment table, their faces flushed with excitement as they whispered and giggled about which young men might ask them to dance. Eleanor was 20 years old, and she knew she should be among them, should be excited about the possibility of romance and courtship like they were, but the thought felt foreign to her now. Everything had changed when her father died, leaving her and her mother with nothing but debts and the small cabin that was not even paid for. "Eleanor, dear, I am so glad you came." Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the general store owner, appeared beside her with a cup of hot cider. "Your mother told me she had convinced you. Here, drink this. You look frozen half to death." "Thank you, madam." Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "It is kind of you." "Nonsense. Your father was a good man, and we all miss him terribly." Mrs. Henderson patted her shoulder gently. "But he would want you to live, child, to dance and laugh and find joy where you can. The world does not stop turning because our hearts are broken." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Mrs. Henderson moved away to greet other guests. The music changed to a slower waltz, and several couples moved onto the dance floor. Eleanor sipped her cider and tried to make herself as small as possible, hoping that if she just sat quietly enough, the evening would pass without incident, and she could return home having satisfied her mother's wishes. She did not notice the cowboy watching her from across the room. Owen Irving had ridden into Ouray 2 weeks earlier, following the promise of ranch work from a man he had met in Durango. At 24, he had been working cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, drifting from ranch to ranch across Colorado and New Mexico, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had learned early that roots meant vulnerability, meant the kind of pain that came when things you cared about were taken away. And he had decided long ago that the loneliness of the trail was preferable to the devastation of loss. But something about the young woman sitting alone against the wall made him pause. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and her face held a kind of quiet sadness that he recognized all too well. While the other young women at the dance were animated and social, this one sat apart, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were trying to disappear. Owen found himself drawn to her in a way he could not quite explain, and before he could talk himself out of it, He was crossing the room toward her. Eleanor looked up in surprise as a shadow fell across her, and she found herself staring at a tall man with sandy brown hair and gray eyes that seemed kind despite the weathered lines around them. He wore clean clothes, clearly his best, and held his hat in his hands as he looked down at her. "Madam, I was wondering if you might do me the honor of this dance," he said, and his voice was low and gentle, with a hint of nervousness that made him seem less intimidating. I am not really dancing tonight," Eleanor stammered, caught off guard. "I am just here to listen to the music." "That is a shame, because this is a real fine song and I hate to waste it standing here alone." He smiled at her, and it transformed his face entirely, making him look younger and more hopeful. "My name is Owen Irving. I am new to town, working at the Morrison Ranch just north of here. And you are?" "Eleanor Daniels." She did not know why she told him her name, but it seemed rude not to after he had introduced himself so politely. "Well, Miss Daniels, it would make my evening considerably better if you would take pity on a lonely cowboy and dance just this one song with me." He extended his hand, and Eleanor found herself looking at it as if it were some kind of puzzle she needed to solve. She should say no. She had no interest in dancing, no interest in making conversation with strangers, no interest in anything but getting through this evening and returning to the safety of her grief. But there was something in Owen Irving's eyes that made her hesitate, something that suggested he understood what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. And before she knew what she was doing, she had placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. The moment his hand settled on her waist and he took her other hand in his, Eleanor felt a jolt of something she could not name. He was warm and solid, and he danced with a quiet confidence that made it easy to follow his lead. They moved together in time to the music, and for a few moments, Eleanor forgot to be sad, forgot to be worried about money and the future, forgot everything except the feeling of being held and guided across the floor. "You are a good dancer," Owen said softly, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her cheeks warm. "So are you. I would not have expected a ranch hand to dance so well. My mother insisted I learn when I was young. Said no son of hers would grow up not knowing how to treat a lady properly." There was a flicker of pain in his eyes when he mentioned his mother, there and gone so quickly Eleanor almost missed it. That was a long time ago. "Where is she now, your mother?" "Gone. Both my parents are. Fever took them when I was 16. He said it matter-of-factly, but Eleanor heard the echo of old grief in his words, and she understood then why he had looked at her the way he had. He recognized a fellow mourner. "My father died 3 months ago," she found herself saying. "Mining accident. He went to work one morning and never came home." Owen's hand tightened slightly on hers, a gesture of comfort. "I am sorry. That is a hard thing to carry, especially at Christmas." "Yes." Eleanor was surprised to feel tears prickling at her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. "My mother thought coming here tonight would help, but I am not sure anything helps, really." "No, I suppose not. But sometimes going through the motions is all we can do until the weight gets a little lighter." The music ended, but instead of releasing her, Owen held on for a moment longer. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Daniels. It was the best part of my evening so far." She expected him to bow and walk away then, to return to wherever he had been before he approached her, but instead he stayed close as they left the dance floor. "Would you dance the next one with me as well?" he asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question, as if he genuinely cared about her answer. Eleanor knew she should say no, should return to her chair and maintain the distance she had been so carefully cultivating, but she found herself nodding instead. "All right. Just one more." But one dance became two, and two became three, and before Eleanor quite realized what was happening, she had danced every single song with Owen Irving. He was easy to talk to, asking her questions about her life in Ouray, about her work helping her mother take in sewing and laundry, about the books she liked to read when she had a spare moment. He listened with genuine interest, his gray eyes never leaving her face, and Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she had not expected. In turn, Owen told her about his life on the trail, about the ranches where he had worked from Montana to New Mexico, about the vast open spaces he had seen, and the hard lessons he had learned about survival and self-reliance. He spoke carefully, as if unused to talking about himself, but Eleanor sensed a deep loneliness beneath his words, a longing for connection that he had been denying himself for years. "Why do you keep moving?" she asked as they waltzed to a slower song, the evening growing late around them. "Why not settle somewhere, find a permanent position?" Owen was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "I suppose I have always been afraid that if I stayed in one place too long, I would start to care too much, and then I would just get hurt again when it all fell apart. Easier to keep moving, keep things simple. That sounds lonely." "It is." He met her eyes, and the honesty there took her breath away. "But tonight, dancing with you, I am starting to wonder if maybe lonely is not the same as safe. Maybe it is just lonely." Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she simply allowed herself to be held as they moved across the floor. She was aware of the other townspeople watching them, could feel the weight of their curious gazes, but for the first time in months, she did not care what anyone thought. Owen Irving made her feel seen in a way she had not felt since her father died, and the relief of that was almost overwhelming. When the final song of the evening ended and Mr. Patterson announced that the band was done for the night, Eleanor felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She had spent the entire dance with this stranger, this drifting cowboy who would probably be gone in a few months when the work dried up or his restlessness took over. And now she would have to return to reality, to her small cabin and her worried mother and the endless struggle to make ends meet. Owen walked her to the coat rack and helped her into her worn wool cloak, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "May I walk you home, Miss Daniels? It is dark out and the roads can be treacherous with all this snow." "I came with my mother. She is over there, talking to Mrs. Patterson." Eleanor gestured across the room to where her mother stood, deep in conversation with the fiddler's wife. "Then may I walk you both home?" Before Eleanor could answer, her mother appeared at her elbow, her eyes bright with curiosity as she looked between her daughter and the tall cowboy. "Eleanor, dear, are you ready to go?" "Oh, I do not believe we have met, sir." "This is Owen Irving, mother. He works at the Morrison Ranch. We have been dancing." Eleanor felt her cheeks heat as she made the introduction, suddenly aware of how it must look that she had spent the entire evening with one man. How lovely. Her mother, whose name was Margaret, smiled warmly at Owen. "I am Margaret Daniels, Eleanor's mother. It was very kind of you to keep my daughter company this evening. She has not had much reason to smile lately." "The pleasure was entirely mine, madam. I was just asking if I might walk you both home. It is a cold night, and I would feel better knowing you got there safely." Margaret's smile widened, and Eleanor knew her mother was already imagining all sorts of romantic possibilities. "That would be wonderful, Mr. Irving. We are just on the edge of town, not far at all." The three of them made their way out into the cold December night, their breath forming clouds in the air. The streets of Ouray were quiet, most of the town's residents still inside the hall saying their goodbyes, and overhead the stars blazed with an intensity that only winter skies could achieve. Snow crunched under their feet as they walked, and Owen offered his arm to Margaret while staying close to Eleanor's side. Their cabin was indeed not far, a small structure that her father had built with his own hands when they first moved to Ouray 5 years earlier. It sat at the base of the mountains, surrounded by aspens that stood bare and ghostly in the moonlight. Margaret thanked Owen profusely for his kindness and then excused herself, claiming exhaustion but giving Eleanor a meaningful look before disappearing inside. Eleanor and Owen stood in the snow, suddenly awkward now that they were alone and the evening was truly ending. "Thank you for walking us home," Eleanor said softly. "And for the dances, all of them. I had not expected to enjoy tonight, but I did. I am glad I did too." Owen shifted his weight, looking uncertain. "Miss Daniels, I know I am just a ranch hand with no prospects and no real future, but I would very much like to see you again, if you would allow it." Eleanor's heart skipped in her chest. She should be practical, should remember that cowboys like Owen Irving were not the marrying kind, should protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak that would come when he drifted on to the next town. But standing there in the moonlight, seeing the hope and nervousness in his eyes, she found she did not want to be practical. She wanted to say yes. "I would like that," she whispered, and the smile that broke across Owen's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "May I call on you tomorrow? In the afternoon, perhaps, if you are free?" "Yes, I will be home all day. We do our laundry work in the mornings, but the afternoons are usually quiet. Then I will be here." He reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and sweet, and it made Eleanor's breath catch. "Good night, Miss Daniels. Sleep well." "Good night, Mr. Irving." She watched him walk back toward town, his tall figure eventually disappearing into the darkness, and then she went inside to face her mother's inevitable questions. Margaret was waiting by the fire, her sewing in her lap but her attention clearly elsewhere. "Well," she said the moment Eleanor closed the door. "Tell me everything. Who is he? Where is he from? What are his intentions?" "Mother, I hardly know him. We just met tonight." Eleanor removed her cloak and hung it by the door, trying to sound casual even as her heart still raced. "You danced every single song with him, Eleanor, every single one. The whole town noticed. Mrs. Henderson told me he never took his eyes off you the entire evening." Eleanor sank into the chair across from her mother, unable to hide her smile. "He is nice, kind. He asked if he could call on me tomorrow. And you said yes." "I did." Margaret set down her sewing and reached across to take her daughter's hands. "Eleanor, I know these past months have been hard. I know you feel like you need to take care of me, like you cannot think about your own happiness when we are struggling so much. But your father would want you to live your life, to find love if you can. Do not close yourself off because you are afraid of more loss. What if he leaves? Cowboys like him, they do not stay. He as much as told me he has been drifting for years, never putting down roots. What if I let myself care and he just rides away? What if you do not let yourself care and you miss out on something wonderful?" Margaret squeezed her hands gently. "Love is always a risk, darling, but it is a risk worth taking." Eleanor thought about Owen's gray eyes, about the way he had held her when they danced, about the loneliness she had heard in his voice when he talked about his life on the trail. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe some risks were worth taking, even when you were scared. The next afternoon, Eleanor had just finished helping her mother hang the last of the laundry when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up to see Owen riding toward the cabin on a sturdy bay gelding, and her stomach fluttered with a mixture of nerves and excitement. He had come, just as he said he would. He dismounted and tied his horse to the post near the door, then removed his hat and approached with a smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Daniels. I hope I am not too early." "Not at all. Your timing is perfect." Eleanor wiped her damp hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious about her plain work dress and the wisps of hair that had escaped from her bun. "Would you like some coffee?" "We do not have much, but I just made a fresh pot." "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." They sat on the small porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and sipping their coffee while the winter sun slanted through the mountains. Owen asked her more about her father, about what he had been like, and Eleanor found herself telling stories she had not shared with anyone since the funeral. She told him about her father's terrible singing voice and his love of bad jokes, about the way he had taught her to fish in the mountain streams, and how he had always smelled like pipe tobacco and pine sap. "He sounds like he was a good man," Owen said quietly when she finished. "The kind of father a child would be lucky to have. He was. I miss him every day." Eleanor stared out at the mountains, at the peaks where her father had died. "Sometimes I am so angry at him for leaving us, even though I know it was not his fault. We are struggling so much, and I do not know how we are going to make it through the winter. The mine company gave us a small settlement, but it is almost gone, and we owe money on this cabin, and I just feel so lost." She had not meant to say all of that, had not meant to burden this man she barely knew with her worries, but the words had spilled out before she could stop them. Owen was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor worried she had said too much, had revealed too much of her desperation and fear. "I have some money saved," Owen said finally, and Eleanor's head snapped up in surprise. "Not a lot, but enough. If you needed help with the cabin payment, I could." "No." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Thank you, but no, I cannot take your money, Mr. Irving. We barely know each other, and that would not be right. I did not mean to offend you. I hate seeing you worried like this. If there is any way I can help, I want to." The sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. "You are helping just by being here, by listening. That means more than you know." They talked for hours, until the sun started to set and the temperature dropped even further. Owen told her more about his travels, about sleeping under the stars and the different ranches where he had worked, about the friends he had made and left behind as he drifted from place to place. Eleanor told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher someday, about the small schoolhouse in town, and how she sometimes helped the current teacher, Miss Roberts, with the younger children. "You would make a wonderful teacher," Owen said, and the certainty in his voice made Eleanor's heart warm. "You have a kind way about you, patient. Children would love you. It is just a dream. I cannot afford the training, and right now I need to help my mother. Dreams are a luxury I cannot afford. Maybe not now, but someday. Do not give up on your dreams, Eleanor. They are what keep us going when times are hard." When Owen finally left as darkness fell, promising to return the next day if she would have him, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months. Her mother was right. This was a risk, caring for someone who might leave, but it was also a chance at something real, something good, and she was tired of living in the shadow of grief and fear. Owen came back the next day, and the day after that, and soon his daily visits became a routine that Eleanor looked forward to with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. They would sit on the porch if the weather allowed, or by the fire inside if it was too cold, and they would talk about everything and nothing. Owen brought her small gifts, nothing expensive but thoughtful things like a book of poetry he had found at the general store, a warm scarf he had bought from a traveling merchant, a smooth river stone he had picked up because its color reminded him of her eyes. Margaret watched the courtship with approval, often finding excuses to leave them alone together, and Eleanor knew her mother was hoping this would turn into something permanent. Eleanor was starting to hope the same thing, even as she tried to guard her heart against the inevitable hurt. 2 weeks after the Christmas dance, Owen arrived at the cabin with a serious expression that made Eleanor's stomach drop. He helped her with the morning chores without speaking much, and she knew something was wrong, could feel it in the tension of his shoulders and the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. "What is it?" she finally asked as they stood in the small barn, mucking out the stall of their one milk cow. "You have been quiet all morning. Did something happen?" Owen set down his pitchfork and turned to face her, his gray eyes troubled. "Mr. Morrison, my boss, he is selling the ranch. His health is failing and his children do not want to keep it running. He told all the hands yesterday that we will have work through the end of January and then we are on our own." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with panic. "So you will have to move on, find work somewhere else." "That is what I should do. It is what I have always done." Owen stepped closer to her, his expression intense. "But I do not want to, Eleanor. For the first time in my life, I do not want to leave. I want to stay here with you, but I do not know how to make that work. I have no job prospects, no way to support myself, let alone a wife." The word wife hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "You are thinking about marriage," Eleanor whispered, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I have been thinking about it since the night of the dance, if I am being honest. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, but I have never felt like this about anyone. You make me want to stop running, to build a life instead of just surviving." He took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. "But I cannot ask you to marry a man with no prospects, no way to take care of you properly. That would not be fair." Eleanor's mind was racing. Marriage to Owen Irving meant security of a different kind, the security of being loved and wanted, but it also meant risk. What if he could not find work? What if his restlessness took over and he regretted staying? What if she let herself believe in this and it all fell apart? But looking into his eyes, seeing the fear and hope warring in his expression, she realized that she had already made her choice. She had made it the moment she took his hand at the dance, the moment she agreed to let him into her life. Love was always a leap of faith, and she was ready to jump. "Owen, my mother and I are barely scraping by as it is. I cannot offer you anything except a falling-down cabin with a mortgage we can barely pay and a future that is uncertain at best. But I feel the same way you do. These past 2 weeks have been the happiest I have been since my father died, and I do not want that to end." She took a shaky breath. "If you want to stay, if you want to try to build a life here together, then I am willing to take that risk with you." Owen's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Eleanor could hear his heart racing, matching the frantic beat of her own, and she wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the scent of leather and horses and winter air that clung to him. "I will find work," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I will do whatever it takes. I will not let you down, Eleanor, I swear it. I know you will not." And somehow, despite all the uncertainty, she did know. She trusted this man in a way that defied logic, trusted him with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than reason. Owen pulled back just enough to look at her, and then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Eleanor felt something inside her that had been frozen since her father's death finally began to thaw. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Eleanor Daniels. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you deserve." "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." They told Margaret that evening, and while Eleanor had expected her mother to be happy, she was not prepared for the depth of Margaret's relief. Her mother embraced Owen like he was already family. tears running down her face as she thanked him for bringing light back into her daughter's life. "When?" Margaret asked, practical as always. "When will you marry?" Owen looked at Eleanor, letting her decide. "Soon," Eleanor said. "Before the end of January, before the ranch closes. That way we can all face whatever comes next together." They decided on the second week of January, giving themselves just enough time to prepare but not so long that the uncertainty would eat away at them. The ceremony would be small, just family and a few close friends, held in the small church at the center of Ouray with Pastor Williams officiating. Eleanor had no money for a fancy dress, but Margaret had an old wedding dress that they altered to fit, and Mrs. Henderson donated flowers from her greenhouse as a wedding gift. In the meantime, Owen spent every spare moment looking for work. He talked to every ranch owner, every business proprietor, every mine foreman in the area, but work was scarce in the winter months, and most places had all the hands they needed. Eleanor could see the frustration building in him, the fear that he would not be able to provide, and she did her best to reassure him that they would figure it out together. A week before the wedding, Owen came to the cabin with news. He looked exhausted but triumphant, and Eleanor knew immediately that something had happened. "I found work," he said, sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around. "Regular work with decent pay." "Where? Doing what?" Eleanor laughed, dizzy from the spinning and the relief. "The stage line. They need drivers for the route between Ouray and Silverton, running mail and passengers through the mountains. It is hard work, especially in winter, but it pays well and it is steady. Mr. Patterson, the fiddler, he runs the line, and he said he remembered me from the dance. Said anyone who would dance every song with a lonely girl was the kind of man with dedication, and that is what he needed in a driver." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "Owen, that is wonderful. That is perfect. It means I will be gone for a few days at a time, making the runs, but I will always come home to you. And the pay is enough that we can keep up with the mortgage on the cabin and save a little besides." He set her down gently, cupping her face in his hands. "We are going to make this work, Eleanor. I promise you." The wedding day arrived cold and clear, the mountains standing stark and beautiful against a brilliant blue sky. Eleanor wore her mother's altered dress, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and carried a small bouquet of hothouse roses that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on providing. Owen wore a new suit that he had purchased with part of his advance pay from the stage line, and when Eleanor saw him waiting for her at the altar, her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. Pastor Williams performed a simple ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage, and when Owen slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, Eleanor knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. They exchanged vows, Owen's voice steady and sure despite the emotion in his eyes, and Eleanor's clear and strong despite her tears. And when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget there was anyone else in the church. The small reception was held at the town hall, the same place where they had danced at Christmas, and this time when Owen led Eleanor onto the floor for the first dance as husband and wife, she was not alone and sad but filled with joy and hope. They danced every song again, just like they had that first night, and Eleanor thought about how much had changed in just 3 weeks, how a lonely Christmas dance had turned into the beginning of a whole new life. The winter months were hard, as they had known they would be. Owen's work with the stage line was dangerous, driving through mountain passes in the snow and ice, and Eleanor spent every day he was gone worrying that something would happen to him, that she would lose him the way she had lost her father. But he always came home to her, sometimes frost-bitten and exhausted but always alive, always ready to hold her and tell her about the journey, They settled into a rhythm, Owen working his routes while Eleanor and Margaret continued taking in sewing and laundry. The combined income was enough to keep them afloat, to make the mortgage payments and keep food on the table, and slowly, very slowly, they began to build a small savings. Eleanor continued helping at the schoolhouse when she could, and the teacher, Miss Roberts, began hinting that when she retired in a few years, she would recommend Eleanor as her replacement. Spring came to the mountains with a rush of meltwater and wildflowers, and with it came news that made Eleanor's heart race with a different kind of nervousness. She was pregnant, the doctor confirmed, due sometime in late October or early November. When she told Owen, he wept openly, holding her close and murmuring promises about being a good father, about keeping them all safe, about building a future worth having. "We need more space," Owen said one evening in May, looking around their small cabin. "With the baby coming and your mother here, we are going to be cramped. What if I added on a room or two? I could do the work myself, save money that way." "Can we afford the materials?" Eleanor asked, ever practical. "I have been saving. And Mr. Patterson said he would give me extra work if I wanted it, running some of the local delivery routes in addition to the mountain stages. Between that and your sewing, we can manage it." True to his word, Owen spent every spare moment that summer building. He added 2 rooms onto the back of the cabin, one that would serve as a bedroom for Eleanor and him, and another smaller one for the baby. Margaret insisted on helping, holding boards and mixing mortar, and Eleanor did what she could despite her growing belly, painting and sewing curtains, and making the new spaces feel like home. The neighbors helped too, in the way that small mountain communities do. Mr. Morrison, the rancher who had sold his property, came by with lumber he no longer needed. Mrs. Henderson donated paint and fabric. Even old Mr. Patterson showed up one Saturday with his sons, and together they raised the roof beams in a single day, working until the sun set behind the mountains, and everything glowed gold and purple in the twilight. By the time autumn arrived and the aspens turned their brilliant gold, the cabin had been transformed. It was still small, still humble, but it was solid and warm and filled with love. Eleanor nested frantically in those final weeks before the baby came, washing tiny clothes that Mrs. Henderson's daughter had passed down, arranging and rearranging the cradle that Owen had built with his own hands, making sure everything was perfect. The baby came on a cold November night, 2 weeks after Eleanor's 21st birthday. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Eleanor was sure she could not do it, could not endure another minute of the pain. But Owen stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And when their son finally arrived, red-faced and howling with outrage at being thrust into the cold world, Eleanor forgot all about the pain in the overwhelming rush of love she felt. They named him Thomas Owen Irving, after both of his grandfathers, and he was perfect in every way. Owen held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets, and Eleanor knew in that moment that her cowboy would never drift again. He had found his home, found his reason to stay, and it was right here in this small cabin with his family. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Owen continued driving for the stage line, working his way up to become one of Mr. Patterson's most trusted employees. Eleanor took over the schoolhouse when Miss Roberts retired, teaching the children of Ouray their letters and numbers, and filling her days with the kind of purposeful work she had always dreamed of. Margaret lived with them until she passed peacefully in her sleep 5 years later, having seen her daughter happy and settled and knowing her grandchildren, because Thomas was not their only child. 2 years after he was born, they had a daughter they named Rose Margaret, with Eleanor's dark hair and Owen's gray eyes. And 3 years after that, another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful and loved to help his father with the horses. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Owen eventually saved enough to buy the property outright, paying off the mortgage that had hung over their heads for so long. He built a barn and a proper workshop, and on the weekends when he was not working, he could be found teaching his sons to work with wood and rope, passing on the skills he had learned in his years as a cowboy. Eleanor's school grew too, becoming known throughout the region for its excellent instruction, and she took pride in seeing her students go on to successful lives. Some went to college in Denver or Colorado Springs. Others stayed in Ouray to work the mines or ranches, but all of them carried with them the lessons she had taught about kindness and perseverance, and the importance of community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen surprised Eleanor with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since they had married. They left the children with a neighbor and took the stage to the city, spending 3 glorious days exploring and eating in restaurants and staying in a real hotel. On their last evening, as they walked through the city streets hand in hand, Owen stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "You remember that Christmas dance?" he asked, and Eleanor smiled because of course she remembered. She would never forget. "Every detail," she said. "I was so sad that night, so lost, and then you asked me to dance. You looked like I felt, alone in a room full of people. I could not walk away from that, could not leave you sitting there like that." He pulled her close, right there in the middle of the street with people walking around them. "Asking you to dance was the best decision I ever made. You gave me a home, Eleanor. You gave me a reason to stop running. And you gave me hope when I thought I had lost it forever. You showed me that it was possible to be happy again, even after loss." She reached up to cup his face, this man who had been a stranger once but was now the center of her world. "I love you, Owen Irving. I will love you until the day I die. And I will love you longer than that," he whispered before kissing her, and Eleanor knew it was true. They returned to Ouray to find that Thomas had helped the neighbors with all the chores, and Rose had baked a slightly lopsided cake to welcome them home, and little James had drawn them pictures of the mountains that Eleanor hung in her classroom. The cabin was chaotic and noisy and full of life, and Eleanor had never been happier. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas became a skilled carpenter like his father, taking over much of the building work in Ouray as Owen began to slow down. Rose shocked everyone by announcing her intention to become a doctor, and with Eleanor and Owen's support, she went east to medical school, returning years later to open a practice in their small town. James followed in his mother's footsteps, becoming a teacher and eventually taking over the school when Eleanor decided to retire. Owen and Eleanor grew old together, their hair turning gray and their steps slowing, but the love between them never dimmed. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, the same porch where Owen had first courted her all those years ago, and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose and purple. They would hold hands and talk about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built together, about how grateful they were for that Christmas dance so long ago. "You ever regret staying?" Eleanor asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had kept drifting?" Owen turned to look at her, and his eyes still held that same intensity they had held when he was a young cowboy asking a sad girl to dance. "Not for one single second. Every good thing in my life came from the moment I decided to stop running and build something real. You are my home, Eleanor. You always have been." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and thought about how strange and wonderful life was. How a single decision, a single dance could change the entire trajectory of a life. How love could grow from the smallest seed of connection into something that sustained you through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. Their grandchildren would sometimes ask them to tell the story of how they met, and Eleanor and Owen would take turns recounting that Christmas dance in 1875, the music and the snow and the loneliness that had drawn them together. They would talk about Owen asking her to dance every single song, about how he had walked her home through the snow, about the courtship that followed, and the leap of faith they had both taken in choosing love over fear. Was it really love at first sight, Grandpa? One of the children would invariably ask, and Owen would smile. I do not know if it was love at first sight exactly, he would say, glancing at Eleanor with warmth in his eyes. But it was recognition. I saw someone who understood what it felt like to be lonely, to be hurting, and I wanted to ease that pain if I could. And somewhere in the dancing and the talking and the getting to know each other, recognition became friendship, and friendship became love. And love became a lifetime, Eleanor would add, squeezing his hand. When Owen died at the age of 72, having lived a full and rich life, Eleanor grieved deeply but without regret. She had loved him for nearly 50 years, had built a family and a life with him, and she knew how lucky she was to have had that time. She continued living in their cabin, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone, and she would sit on the porch and remember. She remembered the young cowboy with kind eyes who had asked a sad girl to dance. She remembered the way he had held her, gentle and sure, guiding her across the floor. She remembered every conversation, every laugh, every tear, every moment of the life they had shared. And she was grateful for all of it, even the grief, because the grief was proof of how much love there had been. Eleanor lived for another 8 years after Owen's death, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. Surrounded by the family she and Owen had created. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren spoke about her kindness, her dedication to teaching, her unwavering love for her family. But what they remembered most was the story she and Owen had told so many times, the story of how they met at a Christmas dance when they were both young and lost and lonely. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery on the edge of Ouray, their graves marked by simple headstones that faced the mountains they had both loved. And every Christmas, their descendants would gather at the old cabin, now carefully preserved, and they would tell the story again. The story of a cowboy who saw a woman sitting alone at a dance and asked her for every song. The story of how a single act of kindness bloomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. In the town of Ouray, the Christmas dance became an annual tradition that continued for decades, and the old-timers would sometimes point to a spot along the wall and tell newcomers. That's where Eleanor Daniels sat the night Owen Irving asked her to dance every single song. Changed both their lives, that did. Proves that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to reach out, one person willing to take a chance on connection. And so the legacy of Owen and Eleanor Irving lived on, not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the reminder that love can find you in the darkest moments, that kindness can transform lives, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes when someone asks you to dance. Their story became woven into the fabric of Ouray itself, a testament to the power of choosing hope over fear, connection over isolation, and love over loneliness. The cabin still stands, maintained by the Irving family as a reminder of where it all began. The rooms Owen built with his own hands, the porch where he courted Eleanor, the kitchen where they raised their family. Visitors come sometimes, drawn by the story, and they stand in that small space and try to imagine what it must have been like. Two young people taking a leap of faith into an uncertain future. But the real monument to Owen and Eleanor is not the cabin or the gravestones, or even the stories passed down through generations. It is the love they planted that continues to grow, branching out through their descendants, touching lives in ways they could never have imagined that cold December night in 1875. It is the reminder that we are all capable of transforming someone else's loneliness into joy, that a simple act of reaching out can change everything. Because in the end, that is what love is. It is seeing someone sitting alone and choosing to sit with them. It is asking for a dance when you are both lonely and scared. It is building a life together one day at a time, through hardship and joy, through loss and triumph, through all the ordinary moments that make up an extraordinary life. It is choosing, again and again, to stay when you could run, to reach out when you could pull back, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when the world seems dark. Owen and Eleanor knew this truth in their bones, lived it every day of their long marriage, and passed it on to everyone they touched. And their love story, which began with a cowboy asking a lonely girl to dance every song at a Christmas celebration, became proof that sometimes the most magical moments in life are the ones where we simply choose to be brave enough to connect with another human heart.